Hey all, welcome to Parker's Reefs. In today's episode I want to go back to grassroots reef keeping and bust wide open 5 common reefing myths. Alright, thank you for joining me on another episode of Parker's Reefs, and whilst I am 1 week away from doing a 1-year review of my dream reef tank out in my lounge room, which has got the absolute best equipment of my budget and has the absolute best standards of everything to my ability, this tank is a little bit different. This is my original reef tank, my Red Sea Max 130 that I bought secondhand about 10.5 years ago, that I had very little budget to work with, and I had also very little understanding of reef keeping. But most importantly, I had much lower expectations of what I wanted to achieve from the tank. And I'm happy to say that 10.5 years later, this tank is still achieving those goals. So in my opinion, it is an absolute success. Now, the reason why I bring this tank up is commonly online and in person, I hear a lot of reef keeping myths that get thrown out there, and I just want to bust them wide open. Whilst it is obviously great to have a dream reef tank and have the best equipment and the best layout and the best of everything, depending on what your reef keeping goals are, it's not always a requirement. So let's jump into these 5 myths and I'll explain to you how, or at least why, in my opinion, I think they're busted wide open with this Red Sea Max 130. All right, myth number 1 is that reefing is expensive. Now, whilst I don't want to say that it's not, because it's all comparable or relative to what your budget is and what your other hobbies are like, but whilst I spent a ludicrous amount of money on my dream reef tank, and you can check that all out in the video that I did going over all of the costs before adding any livestock, I'm really pleased to say that 10.5 years ago, I bought this Red Sea Max secondhand for what I think was $150. It was around that mark anyway. By all means, if it turned out to be 160 or 170, please don't crucify me, but it was, in reefing terms, kind of loose change. And whilst the system was empty, it had all of the equipment in it. It had the lights in it, it had the skimmer in the back, it had the return pump. Everything was there, including the stand, the tank, the glass itself was in good shape. It was a very affordable way to get into the hobby. Now, was it the best of the best gear? No. Have I replaced some of it? Yes, but it still does not run anything expensive. I'm running a DIY LED light, which I always find in reef keeping terms to be the most expensive part. Your budget for your reef tank is almost half on lighting and half everything else. The skimmer is an Aquatic 150, which is a skimmer that I don't think they make anymore. If you did find one, it'd likely be in a $10, $20 bargain basement box at your local fish shop. The return pump is a cheap and cheerful Sitch. It's got a basic heater in it. It does have a relatively decent TUNZE wave maker that I did buy secondhand for $100, but all in all, my investment in this tank, in the hardware alone, probably comes in at under $500, which I realize $500 can still be a decent budget for some people, but in the terms of reef keeping, I don't think it's overly expensive, particularly compared to 60 grand on my dream reef tank. Now, the budget doesn't have to end there, because we were talking equipment there and setup costs. The livestock itself in this tank is also equally cheap. I've got a clown that was given to me, my big female Annie in there. I've got a basic Ocellaris clown that I added in. He was a $30 edition. I've got a bicolor Blenny in there, which was I think a $40 fish. And then I splurged a little bit on a captive bred dotty back many years ago that I think was about $80 at the time. Other than that, all of the corals in this system are absolute giveaways. They were pieces that were given to me, with the exception of my frosted rose bubble tips, which I did spend an arm and a leg on many years ago to get the first one. But I am really pleased to say that I've harvested probably around 80 to 90 from this system in that time, and sold them at a pretty penny, so it's actually paid for this tank and a whole lot more in my hobby. So with the exception of the frosted rose bubble tip, everything else in here, from the leathers, the rhodactis, the zoas, that's kind of all there is about any. There's a range of discomorphs in there, as well as the rhodactis. I've got this big turbinara that I did actually buy and was in my dream reef tank, in my previous reef tank for a number of years, without actually being visible. It was only when I pulled that tank down I found it and I chucked it in here. It's doing really well. It's an absolute bare bones system that I still enjoy to this day. The main thing to keep in mind there is the goals for this system. I wanted a basic fish system, not a huge fish load, with some basic bright colourful corals. And as far as I'm concerned, goal achieved. Myth busted, reefing does not need to be expensive. It sure can be, but it does not need to be. All right, myth number 2, and this one I've got to be careful on how I word this because it's not something I recommend for everyone, and if you are just getting into the hobby, please do test your water. It's very important that you get a sound understanding of what your water is doing and what the parameters are doing and how that's affecting your reef tank. That being said, I'm happy to say that I tested this tank the other day for the first time in I think 5 or 6 years. In that time, I even moved it from one room in the house to another room, still didn't bother testing the parameters. Now, would I recommend that to everyone? No. And is the myth I'm trying to bust is to say not to worry about your parameters? No, I think you should, but the myth is don't chase numbers. When I did test the water in this tank, you would be terrified at the numbers. I'll put them on screen now. The phosphate was absolutely through the roof. The nitrate was relatively decent. The alkalinity was through the floor. The salinity was in all sorts of places. Basically, if you saw those water tests online, you would say you need to change everything. Now, that would be the worst thing I would recommend for this system right now. It's been running stable for a long, long time. Will I make some subtle adjustments to try and bring the phosphate levels down? Sure. But am I going to tip everything upside down and try and change it to chase numbers when the system itself is looking great? Absolutely not. So the myth I'm trying to get across here is to not chase parameters. Okay, it is important to know what your parameters are and to keep an eye on them, but it is much, much more important to watch your reef tank. In the early days, it's very important to get an idea of what your parameters are doing and to then cross-compare that to what your eyes are telling you your reef tank's doing. And once you've had a few years practice of that and your eyes and your tank are in sync, you can afford to be a little bit more lax with it. Just keep an eye on your tank. If things start looking a bit off, then you can test your water and chase some parameters then if you must. But realistically, if you've got a good routine going with the system, it should be pretty good for a long, long time. All right, myth number 3, and this one, I know that when people, particularly reefing buddies of mine, come over and see this tank, some of them are terrified when they spot something like an Astorina starfish in here, or potentially an Aptasia, or some Bryopsis or a hair algae. I don't know if it's been entirely lucky or if it's just been the entire lax feel with this tank, but the myth I want to bust open here are pests are absolutely not the end of the world. I know we tend to want to run these entirely sterile systems where absolutely everything is perfect and very manicured. these really sterile, clerical reef tanks where in this system here, as mentioned, I've got a couple of Aptasia. Some of them have been in there for many, many years because they're kind of awkward to get to and I can't really be bothered pulling half the rocks out to treat an Aptasia. I've got Astorina stars in here. I've had bubble algae, which appears to have gone on its own. I'm not sure how. There are some tufts of hair algae or maybe potentially Bryopsis about. Not surprised with phosphate at 1.7 ppm. But I don't worry about it. It doesn't seem to affect things. I know there are a million types of Astorina stars out there and some of them will absolutely devour corals, but in this system, they're not devouring the corals that are in this system, so I don't care. They're fine. Just because some people will describe something as a pest does not mean it's the end of the world. Now, don't get me wrong, if your system is completely overwhelmed with Aptasia or bubble algae is killing everything, yeah, it's a different story, but sometimes I feel like we can do more harm than good when we're trying to remove things like a bubble algae or an Aptasia and can force it to spread, which just multiplies the problem. Then you try and address it again, multiplies it again. Sometimes, and I mean sometimes, it's best just to let them be. If they're not exploding in numbers, let it run its course and enjoy your reef tank. All right, the next myth, and this is one that I can hold my hand on my heart and say is absolutely busted wide open with this reef tank, and that is that reef tanks are high maintenance or a lot of work. This system gets absolutely no work from me whatsoever. Now, I will preface that by saying I do have an automatic water change set up on this system. It's currently doing 3 litres a day or 21 litres a week, which Works out to be a touch over 10% a week, and based on the water parameters that I haven't tested for so long, it's obviously not enough to keep up, but other than that, I don't do anything to this system. I cleaned the glass today, which is the first time since reviewing the Sea Torch algae scraper, and then it was the first time for about 6 months. It was getting to the point where I couldn't see into the tank. I don't even have an ATO on this unit. I don't have a doser. I don't come in here and trim corals all that often. I feed the fish once a day and that is it. Once a week I take out the 20-litre jug and put a new 20-litre jug in for the water change. That's it. Probably 2 minutes a day for feeding, and say 5 minutes a day to swap over, 5 minutes a week to swap over the water jug is all of the maintenance I do on this system. Now, does that go to say that you can get away with doing that, or I could get away with that little amount of effort on my Dream Reef tank? Absolutely not. But again, it is all down to the reefing goals you're trying to get from your tank. I don't need parameters to remain super steady for really precious SBS in here. The morphs, the leathers, the bubble tips, I'm more than happy if the elk drops a little bit, or if it comes back up, or if there's a bit of phosphate, or if the glass is dirty. They don't mind. Okay, basically work out what you're trying to achieve from your tank, build your maintenance around that, keep it something realistic. People get themselves into trouble when they want a tank at this level and they realistically only have time to spend to get it to this level, and then there's a gap. If you want your tank to get to this level and you've got time to spend on it to get to that level, much like this guy here, you're gonna have a good time. All right, last but not least, and this one kind of, I guess, goes hand in hand with the work, but is the difficulty of reef tanks. The myth I hear all the time is that reefing is difficult. I wouldn't say it's difficult. There is an absolute overwhelming amount of information and help and suggestions and ideals and methodologies and approaches and textbooks and you name it. There is a million different ways out there where people will tell you what you have to do to run a successful reef tank. My suggestion would be don't overthink it. The only thing I would bear in mind is to keep those reefing goals in mind. If you know what you're trying to achieve, stick with that. Make sure you do the maintenance on it that you need to do to get to that time, and don't overthink things. This system was always meant to be a soft coral system with a low bioload of fish in there, and with basically zero input from me over the last 6, 7, 8 years, it's absolutely doing that. It is still one of the most beautiful reef tanks in my house, despite the lack of equipment, the lack of crazy high-end livestock, the lack of water testing, the lack of maintenance, the lack of everything that I put into this system. It still looks beautiful, and in fact, I do often think it's the hands-off approach that has made this tank as successful as it is. I don't go chasing numbers, I don't go moving corals around all the time, I don't be putting my hands in the system, I just let nature run its course, and as a result, I've got a really nice nature look reef tank. Alright guys, I will wrap things up there. If I can just conclude this video by saying, please don't take away from this video that I'm saying you don't need to have good lights. If you've got pests in your tanks, it's no big deal. If you don't need to test parameters or anything like that at all, the main takeaway I want to get across to you is that every reef tank has different reefing goals, and you can assess how much time and money you want to put to that reef tank to achieve those goals. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes if you've got very modest reefing goals, like I have with this tank here, a very low bioload and some very basic forgiving corals, sometimes in those situations, you are better off not spending more money or more time on the reef tank. Do what you need to do, let it run its course, and just enjoy your reefing. Because more often than not, I find if you start spending money that you don't need to spend, or you're putting your hands in the tank a lot more than you need to, you're actually gonna have negative results, you're gonna get upset with it, and you're gonna leave the hobby. Sometimes the best thing to do is to just let it run its course, and I think this Red Sea Max here is an absolutely perfect example of it. Doesn't mean I'm not going to care if I've got pests in my Dream Reef tank, or I'm not going to chase parameters in there or anything like that, because it has a completely different reefing goal for it than this tank. Please bear that in mind when you're assessing your own tank, what your reefing goals are. Work out what time you need to spend on your tank, and also what sort of budget's reasonable to achieve those reefing goals. I hope the video has been helpful, guys. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up. If you're yet to subscribe, please do. Like I said, in a week's time, I'm doing the 1-year review on my Dream Reef tank, which, if anything, is the absolute opposite of my Red Sea Max 1 here, Red Sea Max 130 tank here, because it is a big budget and a big time invested tank, as opposed to this guy here, which is very low budget and almost no time invested. Thanks guys, till next time, stay safe and keep reefing. Cheers, bye.